The corridors of Buckingham Palace were quiet that evening, yet every echoing footstep carried a weight, as though the walls themselves were listening. Guard Sergeant Thomas Aldridge moved with practiced precision, his polished boots tapping softly against the marble floors, the metallic clink of his ceremonial sword occasionally punctuating the silence. For 3 generations, his family had served the crown, and loyalty coursed through him like blood. He had seen every corner of this palace, every secret passage whispered about in stories and rumors, yet tonight something felt different. A subtle tension lingered in the air, like the scent of a coming storm. Thomas adjusted the strap of his uniform, feeling the familiar weight settle across his shoulders. The palace was a labyrinth of gilded corridors and shadowed corners, and even after years of service, the vastness of it never ceased to impress or intimidate. Torches flickered in the dim light, their flames casting long, quivering shadows that danced along the intricate wallpaper and portraits of long-dead monarchs. Somewhere, far off, the soft rustle of silk announced a royal passing, though he could not yet see who it was. Every noise had significance here, every movement a potential signal of something extraordinary or dangerous. He paused at the entrance to the West Wing, where Prince William's private study lay beyond the ornate doors. Normally, the prince was meticulous about his correspondence, a task handled by discreet aides and trusted secretaries. Tonight, however, Thomas's instincts prickled at the edges of his calm. A faint sound, a hurried scuffing of paper, a suppressed sigh drifted through the slightly ajar door. His heart tightened, and he pressed a gloved hand to the cold brass handle, listening intently. The air around him seemed heavier, laden with unspoken tension. The palace staff often whispered about the ongoing subtle rivalries between members of the royal family. Prince William, the future king, had always carried the weight of duty on his shoulders, tempered with an unwavering moral compass. Princess Anne, his sister, was famously direct, uncompromising in her approach to protocol, and far less swayed by the soft power of diplomacy that William sometimes relied upon. The two siblings, though bound by affection and shared history, had an unspoken rivalry that simmered beneath their polite interactions. Thomas had witnessed these dynamics from the shadows, silent yet ever present, always observing. As he approached the study, the faint scent of ink and parchment reached him, a subtle but distinct indication that correspondence was underway. The prince's voice, low and measured, drifted through the partially opened door. Though he could not make out every word, there was a tension in it that struck Thomas sharply. He pressed a hand to the wall, his senses heightened. Something was being written, something hidden, something not meant to be discovered by anyone, not even a loyal guard. Thomas's eyes fell to the floor, where a small draft had shifted a loose sheet of paper, revealing the edge of what looked like a folded letter. His pulse quickened. This was unusual. In all his years, he had been trained to enforce rules, maintain order, and ensure safety. Yet never had he been confronted with a situation that tested the very foundation of his loyalty. Every fiber of his being screamed caution. Yet the same instinct whispered that this was no ordinary night. He leaned closer, careful to remain unseen. Through the narrow gap of the door, he caught a glimpse of Prince William's expression, a combination of resolve and subtle unease. The prince was writing with an intensity rarely displayed in public. Thomas recognized it immediately, a letter not meant for routine court affairs, but something personal, urgent, and potentially explosive. He knew, without fully understanding why, that discovering the contents could change everything within the palace walls. The flickering light from the chandelier above caught the sheen of ink as William paused to blot the paper, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was committing to writing. Outside the study, Thomas's ears picked up the faint creak of approaching footsteps. Another guard? A member of the staff? The sound was too measured, too deliberate to be random. He held his breath, muscles taut, every nerve alert. Even a minor misstep could expose him, or, worse, alert the prince prematurely. His mind raced. What could be so important that the future King of England would take such risks in secrecy? He considered his duty, the oath he had sworn to protect not just the members of the royal family, but the integrity of the palace itself. There were boundaries, lines that even a loyal guard should not cross, but tonight, instinct outweighed protocol. The letter, whatever it contained, could have consequences far beyond a simple misunderstanding. The corridors seemed to close in as Thomas's gaze followed the prince's movements. William carefully folded the letter and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket. The subtle shift of fabric against polished buttons, the gentle sigh as the prince adjusted the jacket, was a sound Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. He knew that if the letter were discovered by the wrong person, the ramifications could be immediate and severe. Not only could it ignite familial tensions, but it could provoke the direct intervention of King Charles himself, whose patience was famously thin when protocol was breached. A distant echo of laughter, Princess Beatrice, perhaps, wandering the palace with her usual buoyancy, reminded Thomas that life within these walls always carried contrasts: the frivolity of youth, the rigid demands of duty, and the constant, underlying tension of unspoken secrets. His hand itched to act, to retrieve the letter before it could leave the prince's possession, but he hesitated. One wrong move, and he would not only compromise himself, but potentially betray the very person he had dedicated his life to protecting. The palace clock struck 10, its sonorous chime reverberating through the corridors. Thomas exhaled slowly, trying to steady his racing heartbeat. He glanced toward the grand staircase, imagining the possible scenarios if the king were to learn of this clandestine correspondence. Charles's sharp gaze and commanding presence could turn the evening into a scene of chaos, judgment, and scandal. The thought made the hairs on Thomas's neck rise. For a moment, the palace seemed to hold its breath with him. The faint whisper of silk, the distant clatter of silver in the dining hall, the muted hum of conversation from servants finishing their nightly tasks, all of it blended into a tense symphony of anticipation. Thomas knew instinctively that this night, which began as so ordinary, would not remain so. Something hidden was about to emerge, and he, a solitary figure in uniform, would be at the center of the unfolding storm. A sudden movement from the study door, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, drew Thomas's attention sharply. He took a step forward, boots silent against the marble, and prepared himself for what might come next. His family's legacy of loyalty and vigilance had led him to countless crises, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the moral tightrope he now faced. Should he confront the prince? Should he wait, invisible, for the inevitable? Or should he act decisively, seizing the letter that could ignite scandal and draw the king's immediate attention? As he stood there, the palace seemed to exhale with tension, each shadow and reflection whispering possibilities, threats, and consequences. Somewhere in the silence, a clock ticked, a candle flickered, and a royal secret waited to be intercepted. Thomas Aldridge, loyal guardian of the crown, was poised on the precipice of choice, aware that the smallest decision could reverberate through the halls of power, through royal relationships, and through his own conscience. The night, quiet until now, had finally begun to pulse with danger. The night deepened, and the palace, cloaked in shadow, seemed almost alive with anticipation. Thomas Aldridge remained stationed just outside Prince William's study, every sense heightened, the polished marble cold beneath his boots. The faint sound of whispered footsteps echoed from a distant corridor. Someone moved with purpose, yet the rhythm was uneven, hesitant. A palace maid, perhaps, or a junior aide unaware of the tension threading through the night. Thomas's instincts told him it was something or someone more consequential. Through the narrow crack in the study door, he glimpsed William carefully placing the folded letter onto a silver tray atop the prince's desk. The action seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. Thomas felt a tightening in his chest. The letter was not merely correspondence. It was a secret, a plan, a message that could alter the balance of authority within the palace. He had been trained to notice subtle shifts, small changes in posture, hesitation in movement, flickers of emotion. Tonight, every flicker was amplified. A soft shuffle drew his attention to the grand hallway behind him. A shadow detached itself from the wall, small and deliberate. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure. Young Princess Charlotte, dressed in her night robes, hair untamed from an afternoon of play. She carried a small lantern, its light bobbing with each step, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Thomas's relief was immediate, tempered by caution. The child was wandering without supervision, an unusual occurrence in a palace so tightly controlled. "Charlotte," he whispered, stepping slightly from the shadow to intercept her. His voice was firm, yet gentle, carrying the authority of a guardian without the harshness that might startle a child. The princess paused, startled, but recognized the familiar figure of the sergeant. Her wide eyes reflected both curiosity and mischief. I couldn't sleep," she admitted, voice soft, barely more than a breath. "I heard noises. I wanted to see what was happening in William's study." Thomas knelt to her level, lowering his gloved hand to lightly touch her shoulder. "It's late, Your Highness. You shouldn't be wandering alone. Go back to your room. The corridors can be dangerous at night." He kept his eyes on the study door, aware of every creak and rustle. Charlotte hesitated, her gaze drawn toward the sliver of light beneath the door. "Is something wrong with William?" she asked, voice tinged with concern. Thomas felt a pang of worry. The innocent perception of a child often pierced through walls of duty and secrecy in ways even trained eyes could not ignore. "Nothing you need to worry about," he replied, his tone measured. Yet even as he spoke, the soft click of a key turning in a distant lock echoed faintly from another wing of the palace. Someone else was moving with intent. His pulse quickened. Every fiber of his training screamed vigilance. Charlotte's presence, though innocent, added both risk and urgency. "Stay here," he instructed, placing her gently behind a tall velvet settee. The shadows of the furniture cloaked her small frame, giving him some reassurance that she would remain unseen. He straightened, listening. The shuffle of paper, the whisper of silk, and now a faint, rhythmic tapping against the polished floorboards. It was deliberate, calculated, and it sent a shiver down his spine. Someone was coming toward the study, someone who did not belong. Thomas moved silently along the corridor, hand brushing against the cold stone wall for balance, every step measured. The palace seemed to contract around him, corridors stretching and narrowing with the echo of each footstep. His mind raced with scenarios. Who could it be at this hour? A palace aide, sent by a member of the royal family, or someone more dangerous, seeking the letter before it reached its intended recipient. Every possibility carried weight. A muffled voice reached his ears. Thomas froze, straining to catch the words. The voice was low, urgent, and familiar. "Make sure it reaches her safely. No one else can know." The tone was controlled, but carried an edge of tension. He recognized it instantly. Prince William, speaking to someone just out of sight, arranging secrecy, orchestrating a plan. Thomas's mind reeled. The implications were staggering. If this was intercepted by King Charles, the fallout could be immediate. If it fell into the hands of Princess Anne or another family member, the dynamics of trust and rivalry within the palace could shift in an instant. A shadow passed behind the heavy velvet curtains of the adjoining hallway. Thomas's heart thudded painfully. He crouched slightly, using the folds of the fabric as cover, and caught sight of the figure. A palace aide, young and nervous, moving with trembling hands, carrying a small envelope tied with red ribbon. The care with which the envelope was handled betrayed the importance of its contents. Thomas's instincts screamed at him. Intercept it, secure it, protect the balance of loyalty and secrecy. Yet he hesitated, aware that acting too soon could alert both William and whoever awaited the delivery. Charlotte stirred behind the settee, sensing the tension. A tiny cough escaped her lips, and Thomas's stomach tightened. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand over her mouth, silencing her. The princess's wide eyes stared into his, filled with trust and curiosity. It was a brief, fleeting connection, yet it reinforced his resolve. He was not merely guarding the palace tonight. He was protecting innocence, shielding a child from the unseen dangers that swirled through these halls like smoke. The aide paused, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Thomas held his breath. Every second stretched into eternity. The silence of the corridor was broken only by the distant ticking of the grand clock, marking time with relentless precision. The envelope, fragile and secret, rested in the aide's hands like a live flame. One misstep could ignite a cascade of revelations. scandal, and anger. Thomas's training demanded he wait, observe, and then act with precision. Yet the urgency of the moment pressed heavily upon him. A door opened briefly down the hall, and a faint glimmer of light illuminated the aide's face. Thomas recognized him instantly as one of the king's junior aides, entrusted with minor secrets but not usually involved in sensitive correspondence between William and Anne. The irregularity struck Thomas sharply. Someone had overstepped protocol. The implications were immediate. Secrets meant to be confined to private chambers were now in circulation, and he, the sentinel, had the opportunity and the duty to intervene. Thomas moved closer, silent as a shadow, gloved hand ready to intercept, yet his eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene. He could see the envelope clearly now, tied carefully, almost reverently, as if the paper itself contained the weight of dynasties. The aide's hesitation revealed uncertainty, fear, a lack of experience in dealing with matters of royal consequence. Every instinct in Thomas's body urged him forward. The moment of decision was upon him. A faint creak announced another presence, a whisper of silk, a soft step echoing behind the aide. Someone was following him, yet not from the corridors Thomas had surveyed. It was a calculated intrusion, deliberate, silent. The tension thickened, coiling around Thomas like a living thing. Charlotte remained hidden, unaware of the full gravity of the moment. Yet her presence added urgency, a moral imperative that pressed heavily against his oath of duty. Thomas's mind raced with possibilities, weighing loyalty, secrecy, and the potential consequences of action. The envelope, Prince William's intentions. The unseen observer, all of it demanded vigilance, decisiveness, and courage. The palace, vast and silent, seemed to watch him. Each shadow a potential witness, each echo a harbinger of revelation. And in that suspended moment, the night teetered on the brink of discovery, poised for the drama that would soon sweep through the halls with relentless force. Thomas Aldridge's breath was steady, but every nerve in his body hummed with tension. The aide carrying the red-ribboned envelope moved with careful deliberation, unaware that Thomas shadowed him like a specter of authority. Every step echoed with consequence. Every faint shuffle against the marble floorboards a drumbeat of looming drama. The palace, so familiar by day, had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispered intentions, each corner concealing the potential for scandal. As the aide rounded the corner toward the grand staircase, a commanding voice cut through the silence. "What is the meaning of this?" The words were sharp, icy, laced with authority and thinly veiled anger. Thomas's gaze snapped upward. King Charles III stood at the end of the corridor, eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting movement in the underbrush. His regal presence dominated the space. Even in stillness, he radiated command. The aide froze, the envelope trembling in his hands, and Thomas felt the moral weight of the moment settle squarely on his shoulders. "Your Majesty," the aide stammered, bowing deeply. This, his voice faltered. The king's gaze shifted toward Thomas, who remained partially concealed behind the velvet folds of the nearby hallway. Charles's eyes, piercing and unrelenting, landed on him with the precision of a blade. "Aldridge," he said, his tone sharp. "Step forward." Thomas obeyed, his boots silent against the polished floor. The king's presence was overwhelming. He was a man accustomed to having all knowledge, all power, all obedience within his grasp. Thomas felt the weight of his oath of loyalty, the delicate balance between duty and conscience, press against him. Yet he also recognized the urgency, the letter, the aid, the potential for scandal. It was all converging into a storm that demanded action. "Explain," King Charles demanded, gesturing toward the aide and the envelope. His voice resonated through the corridor, each word weighted with expectation and authority. "Why is this being moved through the palace at this hour? Who authorized it?" The aide's voice trembled. "Sire, it was Prince William's instruction, Your Majesty. He requested it be delivered personally to Princess Anne." The envelope, small but laden with significance, seemed to pulse in the aide's grasp. Thomas's jaw tightened. The king's expression shifted imperceptibly, a mixture of controlled anger and disbelief. Charles had long tolerated his children's private ambitions, but the secrecy, the potential breach of trust, cut deeper than Thomas had imagined. "William." The king's voice was measured now, a dangerous calm. "And you, Aldridge." What do you know of this? Thomas hesitated. His oath demanded silence regarding private royal matters. Yet the safety of the letter and the innocence of those around it pressed heavily upon him. The future of the palace's delicate equilibrium rested on his next move. Before he could answer, a sudden movement drew his attention. Princess Charlotte, still partially hidden behind the settee, had shifted. Her wide eyes reflected curiosity tinged with fear. Thomas's heart sank. She was witnessing the confrontation, even if only partially. Every instinct screamed at him to shield her. To prevent her from being drawn into the rising storm, he adjusted his stance, subtly positioning himself between the child and the center of the confrontation. King Charles's gaze, sharp and unyielding, fixed on Thomas again. "Aldridge," he repeated, voice louder this time, carrying the weight of command. "If this letter reaches its intended recipient without my knowledge, you will answer for it. Speak." Thomas inhaled slowly, weighing the moral dilemma that now pressed against him like iron chains. Protect the letter and risk the king's wrath, or reveal its existence? Betraying Prince William's trust but preserving his own honor? The tension was broken by a quiet, deliberate voice from the shadows. Princess Anne emerged from the adjoining corridor, her posture impeccable, her eyes steely. "Father," she said, voice cutting through the charged air, "I see there is a matter requiring attention. If this concerns correspondence from William, I insist it be placed before me immediately." Her presence added a new layer of complexity. She was not merely a passive observer. She was an enforcer of protocol, a direct antagonist in this unfolding drama. Thomas's mind raced. He had served the royal family for decades, yet never had he been caught between the king's wrath, the prince's secret intentions, and Anne's insistence on order. Every possible decision carried risk. Yet he understood one immutable truth. The letter was more than ink on paper. It contained information that could inflame jealousy, fracture trust, and force decisions that would ripple through the palace hierarchy. As he stepped forward, his gloved hand instinctively resting near the envelope, a subtle rustling came from the aide's pocket. The letter shifted. Thomas caught it in a precise motion honed by years of training, intercepting it before it could leave the aide's grasp. Time seemed to slow. Charles's eyes narrowed further. Anne's lips tightened, and the aide froze, witnessing the sergeant's unerring precision. "You see, sire," Thomas said, voice steady, though his pulse raced. "This correspondence is currently under my protection. I intercepted it to ensure it does not leave the palace without proper oversight. Its contents are delicate and potentially destabilizing if mishandled." He held the envelope deliberately, the red ribbon catching the light like a flare. King Charles stepped forward, each stride measured, radiating authority. "Aldridge," he said, voice low but lethal, "are you suggesting that you, a servant of the crown, dictate the movement of royal correspondence? That you act as intermediary between my children without my sanction?" The words cut through Thomas like a blade, yet he did not falter. "No, your majesty," Thomas replied evenly. "I serve the crown. My priority is the safety of the family and the integrity of the palace. I only act to prevent chaos, not to dictate its flow. If this letter were intercepted by the wrong person, if it reached the public eye or even a rival within the palace, the consequences could be catastrophic." Anne stepped closer, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "And yet," she said sharply, "you have taken unilateral action. How do we know your judgment aligns with that of the king?" Thomas met her gaze, unwavering. He saw in her expression the same sense of moral rigidity he had admired in her throughout the years, a commitment to principle that often left little room for nuance or compassion. "The letter's content," he continued, "is private and sensitive. It is intended for Princess Anne alone, but the secrecy surrounding its delivery creates risk not only for the family's trust, but also for the palace's stability. My duty is to mitigate that risk." King Charles paused, his eyes scanning Thomas, weighing the truth of his words. The corridors, once silent and expectant, now seemed to vibrate with the gravity of the moment. Outside, Charlotte shifted slightly, still hidden but aware, her small presence amplifying the tension. She represented the innocence Thomas had sworn to protect, and her safety was now a tangible factor in every decision. Anne's voice cut sharply through the thick silence. Then let it be revealed to me. Now, we must know the full extent of what William intended. The demand was direct, commanding, impossible to ignore. Thomas's heart beat faster, yet he understood his next move would set the stage for a confrontation that could change the palace forever. With measured precision, he untied the ribbon, allowing the envelope to fall open in his gloved hands. The moment was electric. Every eye, every presence in the corridor, hung on the unfolding revelation. The contents of the letter were no longer a secret. They were about to become the fulcrum of a conflict that would test loyalty, morality, and authority to their limits. Thomas felt the full weight of responsibility pressing down on him: protect the innocent, honor the oath, navigate the king's anger, and contend with the princess's insistence on order. The silence that followed was palpable, charged with anticipation. Thomas knew that, in this corridor, under the watchful eyes of royalty, he had crossed a threshold. The secret was no longer merely William's. It was now a catalyst, a spark in the tinderbox of palace intrigue, ready to ignite. Thomas Aldridge held the open envelope carefully, the red ribbon draping like a thread of tension through the corridor. King Charles's eyes bore into him, an unrelenting mixture of authority, disbelief, and barely restrained fury. Princess Anne stood beside the king, her expression taut, each line of her face sharpened by suspicion and controlled indignation. The aide lingered behind, frozen in fear and uncertainty, realizing he had been thrust into a drama far beyond his experience. Even young Princess Charlotte, hidden behind the velvet folds of the settee, watched with wide, uncertain eyes, her small presence a reminder of the stakes Thomas bore silently on his shoulders. Thomas inhaled slowly, centering himself. He had trained for decades for moments of crisis, but nothing had prepared him for the moral tightrope he now walked. To reveal the contents of the letter fully could ignite a storm within the palace, but to withhold them entirely risked the wrath of the king. He knew that Prince William had acted with intention, a carefully measured plan, yet that plan had now collided with the rigid lines of authority that defined the royal household. Very well, Charles said finally, voice low but edged with steel. Let us see what William deems so secret that it cannot be entrusted to me, his king and father. Thomas felt the words reverberate through him, a summons and a threat wrapped in regal formality. He gestured subtly, signaling Anne to step back slightly, and then carefully began to read aloud the contents of the letter. The words were deliberate, each sentence reflecting William's concern for family, for protocol, and for the trust that bound the siblings together. There were requests for discretion, explanations for private decisions, and pleas for understanding in matters that touched on both family and the crown's public image. As Thomas's voice carried through the corridor, both King and Princess Anne absorbed the message, expressions shifting minutely, revealing glimpses of surprise, tension, and grudging respect for the prince's intent. Yet the danger had not passed. Even as the contents were revealed, the presence of Princess Charlotte, the young aide, and the potential for misinterpretation maintained a palpable edge. Thomas felt his pulse quicken with every word. The king's eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked between the letter and the guard, as though assessing not just the message, but the messenger. Anne's stance remained assertive, yet her eyes softened slightly, betraying an understanding of William's purpose, even as protocol demanded scrutiny. The aide, still trembling, managed to step forward, whispering, "Sire, I did as instructed. I only followed orders." Charles's gaze cut sharply, but his expression softened marginally, recognizing that the aide had acted under duress and obedience. It was a minor reprieve, yet the tension remained, a storm held at bay by Thomas's careful management and unwavering vigilance. "Very well," Charles finally said, breaking the long silence. His voice retained its authority but carried a tone of reluctant concession. "Aldridge, you acted correctly. The safety of the family and the palace comes first. William's intentions are clearer now, though the secrecy has caused unnecessary concern." He paused, glancing at Anne, who inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the nuance of the situation. "The matter is settled for now, but be warned. Such concealment, even by my own children, cannot become precedent." Thomas exhaled, relief washing through him, though cautiously tempered by awareness of the fragile equilibrium he had just preserved. The letter, safely in his possession, had prevented immediate scandal. Yet the emotional and political consequences were only beginning to unfold. Charlotte emerged slowly from her hiding place, eyes wide but trusting, and Thomas knelt to meet her gaze. "You see, Your Highness," he said gently, "sometimes secrets must be protected to keep everyone safe. That is what we did tonight." Charlotte nodded, understanding only partially, yet feeling the gravity of the moment. Her small hand reached out, and Thomas allowed her a brief, reassuring touch on his glove. She returned to her room under his watchful eye, the lantern's glow fading down the corridor, leaving Thomas to stand once more in the tense hush of palace, authority, and shadows. The aide, now composed enough to move, slipped quietly down the corridor, his role in the night's events complete, but his expression still pale with fear and anticipation. Thomas knew that he had not only shielded the letter, but also preserved the delicate balance between obedience and moral action that defined his service. Every decision had carried weight, and the night had tested the very essence of his loyalty. Yet even in the aftermath, the palace held its secrets tightly. Charles returned to his private chambers, Anne to hers, and Thomas was left alone for a brief moment in the dim corridor. The echo of footsteps faded, replaced by the low, steady tick of the grand clock. His thoughts were a whirlwind of duty, morality, and the heavy awareness of what might yet come. The letter's existence, now known to the king and Anne, had shifted alliances, expectations, and trust. The ripples would spread throughout the palace in ways even he could not predict. Thomas allowed himself a moment to reflect, recalling the generations of Aldridge guards before him who had faced peril and scandal, yet never a challenge so personal, so morally complex. He had protected princes, princesses, and kings alike, yet tonight had demanded something more. The courage to act decisively in a moral gray zone, the wisdom to balance secrecy and authority, and the vigilance to safeguard innocence even in the face of royal scrutiny. The corridor was silent once more, but Thomas's senses remained heightened. Somewhere, faintly, he could hear the distant murmur of the staff finishing their nightly duties, the soft clink of silverware being returned, and the whisper of silk curtains shifting in quiet rooms. The palace, vast and magnificent, seemed to pulse with the aftershocks of events that had unfolded in these hidden moments, its walls holding the memory of secrets and loyalty alike. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by a muted, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper of movement from a distant corridor, followed by the soft shuffle of fabric. Thomas's eyes narrowed, trained instincts flaring. Someone was moving where they should not be. Someone unknown, someone intent. His pulse quickened. The night, far from over, had already promised more drama, more intrigue, and more peril. He took a deliberate step forward, boots silent against the marble, hand instinctively resting near the hilt of his ceremonial sword. The palace was vast, its shadows deep. Yet Thomas Aldridge had faced uncertainty before. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of candlelight was a signal he had learned to read, and tonight he would read it better than ever. The envelope, now secure, still held its silent power, its contents known to a select few but capable of shifting the balance of trust, loyalty, and authority within the royal family. Thomas's role as guardian, mediator, and sentinel was far from complete. The king's scrutiny, Anne's insistence on protocol, and William's secretive intentions had collided in a single, potent moment, and the ripples would extend far beyond this corridor, beyond this night. As he moved to position himself near the grand staircase, Thomas sensed the weight of the palace around him, the expectations, the history, the power concentrated in these walls. The distant sound of a key turning in a lock, the soft whisper of footsteps in a corridor not meant to be traversed, told him one undeniable truth. The drama was far from over. And whoever or whatever was moving unseen in the shadows tonight would soon come face to face with the unyielding vigilance of the Aldridge Guard. A flicker of light from a distant doorway caught his attention. He froze. The palace, in all its grandeur and centuries of ceremony, seemed suddenly fragile, a delicate web stretched across loyalty, secrecy, and power. Thomas's eyes narrowed, heart steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Tonight had tested him. Tomorrow promised more. And, in the vast, silent corridors of Buckingham Palace, he understood this one certainty. The balance of family, duty, and secrecy was a fragile thing, and he would not allow it to break on his watch. The shadows shifted again, faint but deliberate, and Thomas Aldridge, sentinel of the crown, moved toward them, prepared to confront whatever threat or revelation lurked beyond. The night, far from resolved, held secrets yet untold, tensions yet unmet, and a storm of royal intrigue gathering its full force. The envelope, the king's scrutiny, the princess's insistence on order, and the innocence of the young Charlotte all hung in the balance. And Thomas, bound by loyalty, courage, and conscience, would face it all. The palace waited in silent anticipation. And somewhere, in the echo of footsteps and the flicker of candlelight, the next act of royal drama began to unfold.